So this morning, we're going to look at 4 of the stories in the Gospel of Mark. Remember, the Gospel of Mark is just one story after another, stories that Peter told to Mark. Mark is the scribe, and this morning we're going to try to go through 4 of those. The first 2 have to do with the Sabbath. The third has to do with Jesus's growing popularity. And the fourth, as we heard Gary say, has to do with choosing the 12 who come to be called the apostles. So we're going to take this, as always, verse by verse. Start with verses 23 and 24. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" So Jesus, I say again, it helps so much if you just picture this, use your imagination. Jesus and his disciples are not in the synagogue, but they're out walking, not along the lake as we saw last week, but now they're walking in the grain fields. They're probably walking on something similar to what we today would call a turn road. So Jesus is looking for opportunities in the world around him to draw from and to teach. But now they're doing this on the Sabbath. And this is where the whole controversy arises with the Pharisees. Jews were not supposed to walk more than 2,000 cubits. That's the equivalent of about 3/4 of a mile. So it's very probable that Jesus and his disciples have already gone farther than that. And ironically, it means the Pharisees have done the same thing because they're tagging along, watching Jesus's every step. The disciples are also plucking grains of wheat. I've actually done this. I can remember as a kid and a young man walking in wheat fields. And when the wheat is getting close to harvest, you can pull it out, rub the chaff and the grain away from it, and you can crunch on it. And you can begin to tell, is that down to about 13.5% moisture? And if it is, then it's ready to be harvested. But Jesus' disciples are hungry. They want a snack. It's the Sabbath. So now they are not only walking too far, which means they're working, but they are harvesting and eating. So on the Sabbath, you were not supposed to harvest or prepare a meal. You're supposed to have prepared your food the day before. So Jesus' disciples have broken several of the sabbatical laws. And so the Pharisees jump on him and tell him that they call him out, ask him why he's doing that. And here comes his answer, verses 25 and 26. He answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he gave some to his companions." So Jesus, now trying to prove to the Pharisees that he and the disciples have done nothing wrong, draws on a scriptural precedent. And we can go back to 1 Samuel chapter 21. 1 Samuel chapter 21 for this. David's on the run from Saul. You may remember the story. Saul, who is king, has decided to kill David, who has killed Goliath. He's rising in prominence. People want him as king. So Saul decides he's got to get rid of David. And so David is hungry, and he has a band of men that are following him. And so David goes to the house of God, to the tabernacle, and he asks for food. And the priest tells him, there is no food here. The only thing we have is the consecrated bread, or your translation might say showbread. Now, back then, and as long as the temple existed, there were supposed to be 12 loaves of bread that were baked every week, and they were set on a table in front of the Ark of the Covenant. At the end of the week, then that bread belonged to the priest, but no one but the priests were supposed to eat it. That's why it was called consecrated or set apart to God. But David, who was hungry, takes that bread and he eats it, and he gives it to his disciples, if you will, those who are following him. So Jesus is pointing out a principle here. Human need always overrides religious rule. Once again, Jesus is telling the Pharisees, you have misunderstood what God was trying to teach you about the Sabbath. So then verse 27, he goes on and he says, then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So in other words, Jesus is saying, uh-oh, Bill, we lost our screen. There's back. In other words, Jesus is saying, y'all have it backwards. Jesus is reminding them of God's intent in establishing the Sabbath. Remember when they were slaves in Egypt, they worked 24, well, not 24/7, they worked 7 days a week, 365 days a year. God says, I'm going to give you a memorial, a sign, a symbol, so you never forget how I have delivered you. So you're only going to work 6 days a week. God's saying, look, even I rested on the seventh day. So the Sabbath was meant to be a reminder of to them, what God had done for them. And so again, the Pharisees have it backwards. They think that God made them to observe the Sabbath. They're putting religion again ahead of human need. So then verse 28, Jesus says something very important. He's already said, look, you've got your understanding of the Sabbath backwards. Remember, Jesus is always telling the Pharisees and those in the religious institution, you have misunderstood God. And so in verse 28, he tells them something really, it's very shocking. Must have been very difficult for the Pharisees to even entertain. And he says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, Jesus has already established he is the Son of Man. He uses that phrase that we can find in Daniel chapter 7. That Son of Man is another phrase, another title for Messiah. Jesus has already called himself Messiah. Now he's saying he's Lord even of the Sabbath. What in the world does he mean by that? Well, one thing I believe he's saying here is that he was around, he was part of establishing that law. We need to remember that, well, sometimes we use the phrase, Jesus has come from heaven to earth. If we're going to understand that correctly, that's not accurate. There was a time when God, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, left heaven and then came to earth to dwell in a human body. And that human body was named Jesus. And so now that we understand that's one and the same, but what Jesus is saying is that he existed before he inhabited a human body. You remember there's a place, I believe it's in John chapter 8, where he says, before Abraham was, I am. So he's saying, look, I was part of establishing this laws with God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. We are the ones who decreed this. So that makes me Lord of this sabbatical law. I am therefore Lord of the Sabbath. Now, the Pharisees had to have at least a glimpse of what he's saying here. He is saying that he is God. Now, again, this is one of those things that we may have heard so many times as a Christian. We've heard so many sermons about it that we just kind of take it as the status quo. But this had to be extremely unsettling, unnerving to the Pharisees. Even the people who are hearing this are probably trying to wrap their mind around it. Who is this Jesus? He has authority over sickness. He has authority over sin. He can forgive sins. And now he's saying he has authority over the Sabbath. He is God. It helps me to imagine if I was one of the disciples And I'm thinking, what? I'm trying to take all this in. Remember, they still look at him as a rabbi. They've yet to see him or proclaim him as Messiah. So that is all that's going on here in these backgrounds. So two thoughts as we come to the end of the story. Jesus is not telling anyone to no longer observe the Sabbath. He is trying to tell them, you have misunderstood the Sabbath. As we talked about last week, Jesus never tried to abolish Judaism. He never tried to set aside the law of the prophets. He said, I've come to fulfill them. That word fulfill means completion. Jesus has come to bring us to a complete understanding of the law and the prophets. And in this particular sense, the correctly understanding the Sabbath. Now, there's one other little thing here I wanted to point out before we go into the second story. If we go back to verse 46, Jesus said, in the days of Abiathar, the high priest. Well, if you read in 1 Samuel chapter 21, Abiathar is not the high priest. The high priest is his father, Ahimelech. So here's an error in the Bible. So how do we explain that? Now, for those of us who are Christians, we're solidly entrenched in our faith in Jesus Christ. It's, just kind of a little blip on the screen here. But maybe for a young Christian, maybe for someone deciding whether or not they're going to be a Christian, how would we explain this? Did Jesus get it wrong? Did maybe one of the scribes in translating or transcribing Gospels? Anyway, I'd be curious. I'd love some of your opinions. Not everybody all at once now. Okay. Well, caught you off guard on that one. Think about that. Wait, okay.
No, Phyllis has an answer.
Phyllis?
Well, first of all, I don't think Jesus gets things wrong. So, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Okay. So maybe Jesus, he's not bound by space and time like we are. God is not. So maybe he knew that this person whose name I can't pronounce was later a high priest, because didn't they pass that down from generation to generation?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So maybe at some point he was a high priest. Maybe it was not in that particular passage in Samuel.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Anyone else? Thank you, Phyllis. Yeah, maybe Mark just wrote it down wrong. Maybe Peter didn't remember correctly, or maybe Peter said correctly and Mark didn't write it down. The point is that the principle here Jesus is teaching doesn't change. So anyway, just mull on that one. We'll come back to it. So now we want to get on to the second story. This is Jesus healing on the Sabbath. This is Mark chapter 3 in the first verse. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. So I love those first two words, another time. I can picture Peter telling Mark, let me tell you another story. Here's another time, then you fill in the blank. So another time, Jesus is in the synagogue. And again, the Pharisees are there. They are the watchdogs. They're watching his every move and his every word. So it says that there was a man there with a shriveled hand. That word in the Greek means that the man was not born this way, but he's had an illness or an injury. Something has happened in his life to cause this. Now, church tradition says this man was either a stonemason or a carpenter, and he hurt his hand as he was working. And I say church tradition because it's based on a writing called the Gospel of the Hebrews. Now, you probably have not heard of the Gospel of the Hebrews, but there's fragments of it that exist today. And the reason scholars and others find it very interesting is for two reasons. The first one is that there's nothing in it that's in contradiction with the four Gospels that we have today. And the second reason is the early church fathers, really through about the first 3 or 4 centuries, quoted it. They saw it as compatible with the four Gospels that we have today. So again, I'm not trying to get you to go buy that and add it to your Bible. I just want you to have that information. Verse 2, some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Now, something here is very important to me. They're not watching to see if he's going to heal. They're already assuming that. And wouldn't you think that would jar them, open their mind and their eyes to the possibility this is the Messiah? But no, their minds are so closed, their hearts are so hardened that it's not even going to be an issue if he heals this man. It's just going to be if he heals on the Sabbath, if he breaks our religious rule. So remember that healing was forbidden on the Sabbath. That was considered work. If you broke your arm or your leg, I could comfort you. I could give you water or maybe a blanket, but I couldn't help or find a doctor to reset that bone until the next day. And it's also, there's some history that goes with this that shows how the rabbis changed their interpretations over the centuries. There was a time when they said, you cannot even defend your own life on the Sabbath. You must simply bow your head before God and die. Well, just shortly before God the Son arrives on earth, there is a war with Assyria, somewhat different than what we call today. It's called the Maccabean War. Maybe you've read about that or heard about that. But so the enemy figured out, we're not even going to fight these Jews 6 days a week. We're just going to wait till the Sabbath. And then, because we know they will not resist. And they slaughtered them by the thousands. So after that, the rabbis changed their teaching. I would imagine so. So then verse 3, it says, Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Oh my gosh. Can you picture this? Here's this guy. He's just come to church. It's just another Sunday. You know, maybe he's still half asleep. If he's got a shriveled hand, maybe, you know, he just has kind of learned to kind of shrink to the back of the crowd. And all of a sudden, Jesus, who obviously is moved by this person, he doesn't punch Peter in the ribs and say, hey, go over there and tell that guy that if he'll hang around after the service, I'll heal him. He doesn't say, go tell that guy, you know, we'll meet him tomorrow morning early at Starbucks and I'll heal his hand. Jesus says, it's almost like he's looking for a fight here. The Pharisees are there. They're writing everything down. And Jesus said, hey, you go stand up in front, right up in front where everybody can see what I'm about to do. And I have a hunch this man with the shriveled hand, probably, you know, he's kind of torn. He's thinking, oh, I know Jesus heals. This could be wonderful. Jesus is going to heal me, but what are these Pharisees going to do to me? Is this going to cost me my job? How are my friends and family going to treat me? I'm about to break this sabbatical law. So, and then I'm sure that people in the synagogue are thinking, oh my gosh, what is going to happen now? They've got one eye on Jesus and one eye on the door. Something's about to happen. And then verse 4, then Jesus asked them, that's everybody in the congregation. Picture that. You don't want to lose that, because something very important is going to happen from this. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? Now, this is a no-brainer. I mean, everybody in the congregation says, well, it's lawful to do good, and it's lawful to save life. It's certainly not lawful to do evil or to kill, right? But everybody's thinking, okay, here's Jesus on one side, the Pharisees on the other. You know, well, any way I step here, I'm gonna be in trouble. So what do? They remain silent. Nobody speaks up. Everybody is so intimidated more by their religion than the Pharisees, and they don't know what to say. And so everyone is afraid. Tension is high. And so let's look at Jesus's response. He looked around at them in anger. Boy, I can just see spiritual darts flying. Can you imagine? Can you picture Jesus angry, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts? That's a word that's basically the same thing for the hardened heart of Pharaoh. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. So this man is healed, but we've still got to address this issue about Jesus being angry. So, Bill, share your thoughts here.
All right, I'll do something kind of brief, because I've got a lot of territory to cover here. And this is a great passage that Ricky has picked out for us today. Let me just talk about this question. I think it's very personal for all of us. It says that Jesus looked at them with two words, anger and with distress. Whenever I hear that, he had anger and he was distressed, I'm remembering when I was just a seminary student and I went to the Methodist Hospital in Fort Worth. I was there in training for my pastoral duties. And they sent me to a really tough ward, the burn unit. And I've told some of you this before. The man in the burn unit was so angry and so mad at everything. He cursed. He used the Lord's name in vain. He was so mean that the nurses and the doctors couldn't calm him down. He was just horrible. So they called a chaplain, of course. Well, the main chaplain said, okay, this is a good time for training. So he sent me, a young guy. Oh, brother. So I went in there trying to read him a scripture and talk to him, and he called me every name that you don't want to hear. And I didn't know what in the world to do. So I just said, well, I'll come back and visit with you later. So I went to the guy that was training me, and I said to the head chaplain, I said, look, this is impossible. This guy is horribly angry. He is so mad. He said, yeah, you know the problem, Bill? You know what his problem is? And I said, yeah, he's been burned 80% of his body. And he's in tremendous pain. And he said, no, that's not the problem you're there for. You're not looking close enough at him. He's looking for somebody who'll listen to him, somebody to give him comfort. And, you know, I thought about this passage here. It's one of theologians think it's one of the key passages in the New Testament about our personal relationship with people who don't know Jesus. And that is, he's saying that Jesus looked, and that word look in the Hebrew has to do with a focus, look deeply, like it's where we get our idea of a microscope. He looked into the details. He looked beyond the surface. And, you know, it was saying to me as a young guy, and I still need it today because I'm still not able to do what I'm supposed to do here, because it was saying, look beyond the surface, look beyond what everybody thinks, what the obvious is. When you see somebody who's angry, they've got a problem beyond the surface. And the next thing is this word anger. Jesus was angry. You can read many places in the Bible. I won't go through them, we don't have time. But there are many places in the Bible where it says God was angry. God had these emotions. Now, listen to this closely. The word anger is a word that we chose in English to translate the old idea of an emotion. How do you put an emotion, a feeling, how do you put that into words? When you lose somebody that you love, when you lose something that's most important to you, a great loss, how do you put that into words? Would you use the word anger? Would you use the word fear? Would you use the word law? What would you use? To me, it seems like we've chosen this word anger, but we got to realize I'm fortunate. I have a wife who's a writer. She's got all kind of words, and I asked her yesterday, how do you express an emotion with words? And she said, you can't do it. The best thing you can do is do a whole bunch of words. If you give one word, you may not communicate what the person's feeling. And I think that's true. You see this word here in the Hebrew, which before it ever became a written word, you remember they used pictures. And the two pictures they used to describe this emotion was a flared nostril, a nose where the nose is flared, well, I can't even explain it. Just, you know what I mean? It's flared like a bull who's getting ready to attack, or like a cat who's being trapped. So how do you express that in English? Well, here, almost all the translators call this anger. It calls it a sense of being upset, a sense of being just so upset, so enraged, so disturbed. So I think what it's saying is Jesus, inside of him, there was a great disturbance. There was a great feeling of something going on inside him. We use that word anger. Let's be careful that it's not the kind of anger you and I think of often, and that is a desire to hurt somebody, a desire to punish somebody, a desire to get back at somebody, revenge. No, not at all. There are two kinds of emotions related to this feeling that we're calling anger. One, there's a godly anger. A godly anger is one that is an expression of a feeling of hurt, a feeling of loss, a feeling of upsetness. Some of you might be able to describe it in a minute. Maybe Ricky will ask you to describe what is that feeling you have that we're calling anger here when it's godly, when God was angry, when Jesus was angry. It's not a feeling of revenge. It's more a feeling of pain. So that's that word anger. I might also mention that some people say that anger is a neutral emotion. It can be good whenever we're trying to express the honest pain and the honest feeling of, I want to do what Jesus wanted to do. In other words, Jesus is our model. And, Paul tried to put it in an expression when he said in Ephesians, he said, be angry, but do not sin. Yeah. Paul said this, you ought to do like Jesus. You ought to be upset. You ought to be enraged about things that are wrong, things that are bad. But don't use that. Don't let Satan turn that into doing something evil. But it's very easy to let Satan trick us, and our minds can trick us. And we can start saying, my anger is okay. It's not okay if it's not like Jesus. And then that other word, one other word there he mentions, Ricky, the word that Jesus was grieved. He was deeply distressed. In other words, whenever something's wrong, if we're like Jesus, yes, we'll be upset, but we'll all also be distressed. And that's the kind of anger he wants us to have. That's about it, Ricky.
Oh, well, I wish you'd keep going. Yeah. So that, thank you for that, Bill. I'm wondering, I know there's been times that I've been angry at God. Not that I wanted to hurt God, but angry that something happened. And in my anger, I thought, well, God didn't stop it or prevent it. Why did God let this happen? I wondered if others of you have experienced that, and maybe you could share in a way that would be helpful to others.
I'll share.
Sure.
About 10 years ago, I lost my stepson in a car accident, and there were 5 teenagers in the car, and 4 of them died.
Oh.
And it was really hard, and they had hit a tree, and so it was pretty severe. Their physical bodies were pretty beaten up. But I think I went through a period of just being stunned and shocked, trying to find comfort, trying to ask why. There were so many people around that were angry and wanting to do something, and the consoling was hard. I think different people self-medicated to ease the pain, and I was pretty challenged with God, like, why did this happen? What do I do with this? And it took me a while to work through it, and I think I got to the other side and realized he was walking with me, as I felt guilty that I was angry, I was sad, I was confused, I was not comforted. And it made me disbelieve that my faith was not strong enough to get me through that. And then I realized that that journey helped me get stronger, because if I hadn't questioned, or I didn't feel that disappointment, that it made me realize that in this world, we do have pain, and he's there, and it's okay to talk to him about that horribleness. And it doesn't, that there's a different kind of comfort with that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Someone else?
Cindy over here.
Okay, yes, Cindy.
Several years ago, we had, okay, this is gonna sound crazy, but I had this little cat that I raised from a baby, and we were like that. I mean, we were like that. And Suki was trouble. On the rug in Ralph's bathroom. Anyway, so one day the back door got not shut all the way, and I guess the wind blew it back open, and she got out. And we had a hole under our fence, and there she went. So I'm out looking for my cat, and I just couldn't believe that, and it was my birthday, and I just couldn't believe that God was not going to bring my cat back. And so I was out there in the green belt behind our house looking for my cat and yelling at God as I'm walking down the street. And it was raining, you know, and I'm yelling at God this whole time, you know, how can you do this? It went for several days. One of my neighbors and I would, she'd come get me at midnight, and we'd be up looking because cats are out that way. And Suki didn't have any claws, so we had coyotes in the greenbelt, and I was just, it was horrible. And God let me yell at him, and the neighbors let me yell at him without saying anything. But it really kind of was, later I felt like it was comforting that he let me yell and be mad at him that he didn't bring my cat back. And it was really hard, and this one got me through it. But and God was there walking with me. I know that now. I didn't know it then because it was not a good time. But he lets us do that, and that in a way is proof of our belief. If you can yell at God, obviously you believe that he's there for you. And you might not have, you know, so the people, and it always, I always kind of laugh, people that say they don't believe in God, and what's the first thing they say when something happens? Oh, God.
Yeah.
You know, how can they say that if they don't believe in God? So, he loves us. He lets us yell and throw a tantrum and walk around in the rain. So.
Thank you, Cindy. Phyllis?
Well, I'm going to make it real personal and present. I'm dealing right now with being a little angry with God. You heard Carol pray for Phil Calhoun in her prayer today. Most of you don't know who he is, but he's a missionary that Norby supports. He's been in Iraq for 8 years as a teacher. This man is trained in rescue efforts, kind of I don't think he was a Navy SEAL, but he has that kind of training. But he's living in danger right now, extreme danger. He's lost 3 of his converts that have been slaughtered in the last couple of weeks. One woman had taken a picture of her own baptism. Somebody had taken a picture of her baptism, and soldiers found it. And because the picture was on her phone, they slaughtered her. And Phil now is in danger of losing his freedom and possibly his life. The other Americans who have been a part of his ministry, they have left. He's the only one left behind. But some of us got to actually hear his voice this week as he was requesting prayer and saying, you know, if God needs me to start a new prison ministry, then I'm ready for it. Well, I've just kind of been angry with God this week about that. Why is it so hard? He's given up his family. He's lived there in probably close to poverty level for 8 years, trying to teach and model the God's way of living. And it's just so hard for him. And I'm reminded I'm asking the wrong question. I shouldn't be asking why. I should be asking how. This man's at perfect peace about all this. I'm the one that's being upset about it. So I'm still working through that because I want God to make it easier for people like him who are serving in hard, dark places. So pray for Phil this week as God leads you to do that.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you for being so honest. Anyone else? These are so helpful. Okay, well, let's then go on to verse 6. See if we can wrap up this second story. Then the Pharisees went out. Remember, Jesus has healed this man, the man with the shriveled hand has had it restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Well, who are these Herodians? Well, first we need to realize that we're only 79 verses into this gospel, and now the religious leaders want him dead. So soon, so quickly. So who are these Herodians? Let me read you a quote here I found. We don't know much about the Herodians except they are supporters of Herod. Herod was recognized by Rome as ruler over Galilee. He was the son of Herod the Great. The Herodians have little in common with the Pharisees, who hate Herod's rule, yet they find common cause in their opposition to Jesus. They oppose him because he constitutes a threat to their traditions, power, and wealth, and both groups resent Jesus for failing to publicly honor them, and especially for challenging their authority and understanding of the law. I think the bigger picture here is Jesus now is just, he's experiencing threat of his life, just like Phil in Iraq. The people now are out to kill him. Now it's more than the Pharisees. It's a group, the Herodians are not a religious group. They are just cronies of Herod, but now even they feel threatened. They feel their pocketbook or their way of life is being threatened. So they decided they're going to work together and try to eliminate Jesus. Well, I'm looking at the time here, so I think we're running out of time. So I'm going to stop right now, and we'll get to these other two stories next week. Before I wrap it up, is there anyone that had a thought, something that they wanted to add?
Ricky, it's Ralph. I'll ask you, since you're kind enough to give us some extra time to talk. You know, your last question or statement about being angry or as Bill explained, distressed. You know, I think some of the challenges for us are how we help people through that. And, you know, it's very easy to say to people, well, you need to pray more, or I'm sure it's part of God's plan for you to be going through this, which is extremely hurtful to people in those situations. Could maybe you have some thoughts about that, or how we help people, you know, maybe just being present in their anger or in their distress, or even maybe Bill has a thought.
Bill, go ahead.
Thank
Or-
you, Ricky. Well, I think not only did my chaplain leader say it, but I've found it, like some of you have over the years, that for somebody else who is being angry, if we do like Jesus, if we are close to Jesus, I think he is our model. Oftentimes, Jesus realized what they really were expressing was their desire for comfort, their desire to let the pain be less. And sometimes maybe you and I, as the healer, not physical healing, but emotional, spiritual healing, maybe just sitting and listening, maybe saying, I'm sorry, I'm feeling some of what you're feeling. And maybe sharing in their, helping carry their burden, sharing in their pain, maybe tell them that you're praying for them. And a lot of times I know with this guy, he had all those burns, he died. But before he died, sometimes I was following, of course, just following my instructor. But he said, just go and sit and shut up, Nichols. Don't read any scripture. Don't say anything religious. Don't try to help him. Just sit there. And anytime he talks to you, just tell him that you understand that you're with him. You're going to stay here. And he said, no, you got to get out of here. He said, no, I'm not leaving. I want to be with you. That sure enough, that old boy settled down in time. So I would just say, I think, Ricky, the closer we are to focusing on the mind of Christ and let the Holy Spirit speak to us to be a healer, and that is to look beyond the physical healing, is probably the best thing we can do. What do you think?
I think that's extremely accurate. And I would just add two thoughts, really just tying in with the first one, the importance of listening. When I think about our Stephen ministry, how important that is. And, you know, Stephen ministry mantra, if I remember it correctly, is listen, listen, love, love. I'm currently working with a Stephen minister, and I know how helpful it is to me just to have someone who will listen. And I think that ties in with the second thought that I would share. Grief is not a problem to be solved. So often when we see someone who's grieving, we want to try to solve that problem for them. We want to say something that is scriptural, or we think it is, or something that may sound religious, or maybe some that's cliche that we've heard somebody tell us. But grief is a process, and everyone grieves differently, and everyone goes through the process differently. And there's some things that which we grieve about that we're going to grieve about the rest of our lives. It's not a problem to be solved. So that's why it's so important just to listen, love.
You know, Ricky, following that, I thought Phyllis was going to tell the story, but I might just say quickly, a while back, some of you remember that one of our friends, he used to be my translator when I used to go down into the valley to preach at revivals and stuff. And she had a little boy, a little child baby, and the infant was very sick at birth, and doctors felt like he was going to die. And Judith prayed and all, and she called me one time and she said, Pastor Bill, I feel so angry and I'm so upset with God that he's not healing, and I feel bad about it. I feel like I'm losing my faith. And some of you may remember when she talked to us over Zoom, she said that she's no longer losing her faith, because one of the things that she discovered as we shared, Phyllis and I shared with her, she was not losing her faith. She had a broken heart, and her broken heart, her loss, her pain was just, her brain was just struggling to find a way of expressing her pain. And I think this anger at God, this anger at the situation, the thing that she was calling angry and the thing that she was calling losing faith was simply the brain trying to express in words what was tearing her up on the inside. And as she continued to pray, as she continued to wait, she continued to be healed by the Spirit and by people who loved her, she got over that. And I think that's very key, is that we got to remember, like Ricky was saying, we don't give over grief. Part of the grief process is anger. And I know there's some of you I'm looking at right now have lost a loved one, lost maybe your best friend. Some of you've lost a child. Some of you lost people. You know what I'm saying? That anger is just a normal part of the brain's emotion. And it's not a quick thing to get over.
Thank you, Bill. Oh, Phyllis?
We don't have time to deal with it right now, but maybe next week you could tag it on. I don't think you can talk about anger without talking about fear, because most of our anger arises out of fear, some kind of fear of loss.
Right.
And of course, I don't think Jesus was expressing the kind of fear that maybe we have at times, but he was still expressing this distress over, I want these people to be a part of my kingdom and they don't get it. I'm losing them, you know. So I just don't, I can't think of anger without fear tied to it, fear of something.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. I'll make a note of that and see if I can work it in next week. Anyone else?
Fred Martin in the back, Ricky.
Okay, thanks. I can't. Go ahead, Fred.
Bill just talked about someone being angry and upset. I tend to think there's quite a difference. If a person is angry, it tends to have the ability to evoke a somewhat violent response. Being upset, it can be upset at the same thing, but it tends to evoke a little more rational response. Okay, a person that gets fired from their job and is truly angry goes back and shoots their boss. Now, another person that gets fired from the job is upset, and they might go back and talk to the boss, see if they could work things out. And I think the key is, when you're feeling an emotion like that, you need to distinguish between which one it really is.
That's good. Thank you. Anyone else?
Think we're good?
Okay, Ralph, thanks.
Hey, Ricky, thank you.